Hello, and welcome to season 2 of Radical Embodiment, the podcast. This is episode 5. I am Emily Wishall. I am your host. I am a certified Rolfer and embodiment coach focused on supporting women in shifting the narrative that our worth is tied into our weight. And I'm really excited to have on today my first male podcast guest. I am interviewing today Mark Walsh, who calls himself Mr. Embodiment. He is the author of Embodiment, Working with the Body in Training and Coaching, and Embodied Meditation. He also hosts a podcast. He hosts the Embodiment podcast, which has over 1 million plus downloads. And he founded the Embodied Facilitator Course. He's trained over 2,000 embodiment coaches. He's worked in war zones, and he's done all sorts of incredible work in the embodiment field. So it really is an honor to get to interview him today and to also get to bring a male perspective onto the podcast and into this conversation around embodiment, around body image, around cultural obsessions with our physical appearance. And I'm just going to, little disclaimer, they are doing some tree work outside of my place here in Boulder, Colorado. The timing is unfortunate, but if you hear background noise on my end, that's like a buzzing, like a chainsaw, that is why that's happening. So go ahead, and here goes the episode, the interview with Mark Walsh. I hope you enjoy it as much as I enjoyed getting to connect with him. Hello, everyone. I am here with Mark Walsh. Mark, welcome. Thank you for doing this. Thank you for letting me interview you and for your time.
Good to be here. I'm on a course going deep, embodying my organs deeply on a BMC course at the moment. And then I kind of run through central London next to the Arsenal station, if people know football, soccer. And so it's been quite a weird last hour, going from like deep visceral
being in your organs to like
running across one of the biggest cities in the world. It's been quite an interesting hour, but I'm glad to be here.
Yeah. Well, I'm actually just kind of curious, if you don't mind, since you just had that experience, and I feel like that's such a contrast of having this deep visceral experience of being with embodying your organs, and then, you know, what is it like to then try and rush across town to make an appointment? So if you don't mind just even sharing to our listeners who that might be even a new concept, what is your own personal experience of when you say, okay, I was just embodying my organs? Like, what does that mean? What does that mean to you? What does that feel like to you?
Yeah. I mean, normally the first question I get on interviews is like, what is embodiment, right? Like
it's usually my first one I ask, but
yeah,
I want to go into what is embodying your organs.
Someone told me yesterday it was my fault that the word embodiment's now being used in front of every course and every yoga thing and everything out there. It's kind of trended, and they were half joking, I think, but I've certainly been associated with that word. I don't think anyone really knows, right? It's one of those things like, you know, what is yoga? You could have a whole podcast called What is Yoga? But that's a cop-out. So, I mean, I define it in a few ways. Shortest one is the subjective experience of the body. So I've, for example, studied the cognitive view of, say, the heart. I know about the ventricles and the atriums and the flow of the venous return and all this, where the aorta is, etc. But that's very different than being present to one's heart, really going deeply into the experience of the heart. So the subjective sense of the body subjective meaning awareness, mindfulness, but also meaning part of who we are, part of our identity. And this in some ways is very commonsensical. You know, we all act like we're embodied, you know, it's, and we could also talk about sort of unconscious embodiment. We see that people are shaped in a certain way, not necessarily their height or their weight or their, you know, whether they've got a six pack or not. But we get a sense of someone through the body. Yeah, I think that's pretty commonsensical. You know, actually a dog would understand that, you know, a child would understand that on a visceral level, if not on a logical level. Just one more, maybe the other way I define embodiment is really as a umbrella term for a field of study. So all the body arts that involve the person, as opposed to simply the objects. So, you know, you're in Boulder, I'm normally in Brighton. There's so many great things we could do in those places on a Thursday evening, if they involve the body, but not just body as, like a machine, but the body as part of a being, part of a personhood, a humanness. whether that be conscious dance and, you know, a lot of yoga, they're not all of yoga, martial arts, they're not all martial arts, body work, even improv, you know, what do these things have in common? They deal with the body, but as an aspect of our being. So an ontological approach to the body. Lastly, I'd sort of say it's a type of intelligence. So like if I'm working in business or something like that, I say it's a way to be smart. You can be more or less, well, we all have an unconscious embodiment. You can be more or less consciously embodied. And there's layers to that, some of which are sort of more short term, some of which are more longer term. And that's all happening within an environment. So, you know, back to your question, like running through central London, there's a physical environment, there's a social environment, there's a cultural environment. And, you know, all that is where we're embodied. And that is all part of the mix. So long answer, but I hope that kind of sets us up for a good conversation.
I think so. I mean, I think there's a lot there too that I'm even just curious to dive into. So it feels like your definition, because I've been asking each of my guests, actually starting with, what does embodiment mean to you? Because people seem to have a unique answer. Your definition seems to encompass a lot of different potentials or a lot of different movement or practices, but it seems like and let me know if I'm understanding correctly, like the body is though the central point, or it's an aspect of how you're orienting in that movement, in that practice, or improv, or in business. Yeah.
So let's differentiate it. So a physical practice would just be the body as an object. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. I could be in the gym doing pull-ups, just trying to get big muscles, fine, no problem. If I did
bicep curls in front of the mirror in the gym yesterday. I was like, I am in front of the mirror at the gym doing bicep curls. It was just an interesting experience.
I think it's part of the journey. I've got really into lifting weights in the gym. You know, and Rob McNamara who's local to you, wrote a very deep book on that. So there is a way we can come back to what looks like conventional practice, but I'd say the average person in the gym is a physical practice.
Got it.
Meaning it doesn't really matter if there's awareness or not. And they're not necessarily trying to transform themselves as people. They're more trying to get, you know, a flat stomach or a bigger bicep, or, you know, this would be yoga as well. If someone was just trying to stretch their hamstring and get more flexible, nothing wrong with that. You know, it could be some real benefits there. And then we've got a mindfulness practice where it's done with awareness. And then we've got an embodiment practice where it's awareness of self. It's awareness. And I said it's kind of awareness and choice. You know, when I'm teaching coaches, I say, look, that's all we're doing, awareness and choice. So the choice is awareness is how am I, right? And there's a mindfulness element to that, but then there's also the element of how am I in terms of my patterns and habits, like more longer term. And that's not something you can be mindful of. That's something you can become aware of, but you can't feel, you know? And then it's just kind of more long-term orientation there, like a pattern, you know, like you might have a Myers-Briggs would be another way of kind of getting at that, or an Enneagram. And then we have choice, which is changing our state and changing our traits longer term through practice. So the development of different states and traits, that's, you know, to me, that's integral to embodiment, not just kind of being aware.
Yeah, that's helpful. That's helpful to distinguish that. I'm curious to have you speak a little bit on the unconscious embodiment and what you mean by that, or maybe if you have an example of how that shows up. And I had a lot of immediate pings in my brain when you said that.
Yeah, I mean, well, we're all shaped in a certain way, right? And when we say we're shaped by what, well, you know, maybe we come into the world with a certain personality. A huge part of its culture. This is the part that North Americans normally underestimate a little bit, in that, you know, on my course, for example, there's people from Brazil, there's people from Ukraine, there's people from Spain, there's people from different countries, and they're different, and you can feel it. You know, like at one point today, I was in a human sandwich with a Greek person right behind me, like very physically close, touching a lot of my body, and a Ukrainian person right in front of me. Now, I've been to Greece, my wife's Ukrainian, I'm pretty familiar with that culture, and we can talk more about that maybe later. And the difference between the two of them was like chalk and cheese. And it was felt, it was in their behavior, it was in the literal shaping of their tissues. So we're shaped by what? By our personality, by life, by trauma, by culture, by our experiences, and by our practices, if we have any. So all those things, like if I was having dinner with someone last night, and they're a yoga teacher who lives in London. And there was a sort of striving, pushing, driving, because the yoga they're doing is also kind of like a vinyasa, strong, you know, powerful kind of yoga. And that embodiment of London energy, plus her practice, which is, you know, lots of chaturangas, you know, that pushing, striving, doing practice was really in her whole system. And this is something we can see. You can literally see if people's chests are a certain way or pelvis is tilted. And we can also feel it. Like I was having dinner with this person and I was like, whoa, slow down. I'm trying to digest food.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, there was an
Yeah,
intensity that didn't fit well with kind of rest and digest. Though this person would be brilliant at running a business and kicking ass, and she was, you know, kick-ass, badass London businesswoman, you know. So we have that unconscious embodiment, and it's impacting everything we do. So this is the huge insight, I think, of embodiment. It's our operating system.
Yeah.
And everyone else is feeling it. It's impacting our relationships, impacting our health, it's impacting our communication. You know, when I work in business, it might be looking at leadership. When I'm working with coaches, it's like, well, yeah, that's, you're coaching from that. Like you can learn some clever technique, but you're always running it on Emily 2.0. Right? It's probably Emily 5.0 by now, actually, isn't it? If you're anything like me, I imagine you are. So it's, you know, so you're always running it on that system. So if we don't know what that system is, then we're kind of blind to like one of the most important things is impacting everything we do.
Totally. Let me know if this is what comes to mind. And it's I think maybe subtly different, but like even when you said like Emily 2.0 versus Emily 5.0, that example, I recently published a book called Radical Embodiment, a practical guide to celebrating the skin you're in. And in it, I talk about this idea of posturing. And I share my own personal story of what I defined as posturing, which was an unconscious pattern all of my life of the quote unquote good posture that at least here in the United States, we're taught. Like I was taught in like second grade, you know, you sit at your table, you have your chest up, and I learned to suck in my stomach. And that was more for me a way of like trying to look smaller, but it was a way that then I always consistently presented myself of posturing in an effort of trying to appear that I was good or I had it together. But I was unconscious that I was doing it until I was actually from a Rolfing session that happened to go into my psoas muscles and had a deep release. I was out walking that evening, and the recognition for me came up on the walk. I realized like, wow, I'm walking. It feels really easy. I feel like I'm gliding. I checked in with myself. I noticed I was really upright and had this sense of just deep emotion come over me because I felt for the first time this ability in my body and my system to feel open and vulnerable, yet have like some sense of strength internally. And for me, I just realized, oh, all my life I've been pretending through my posture. Would that be an example that you think of, like, because and it was unconscious to me? That would be like an unconscious one level, 1 degree. I mean, I know I'm sure I still have a lot, but
I think we have different levels of it, and some of, you know, a lot of them I'd say are about how we get social approval and safety.
Yeah,
right. Like we find a way.
I got a lot of approval because you know, I'm a good little girl. You know, she's got good posture. She looks sweet.
and you know, that level in some ways it's like there's a sort of posturing and a kind of not conscious but still a thing you're doing, you know. A lot of it kind of performative. And then there's maybe an even deeper level there of something that's just like certain muscle groups have really shortened, right? Because this is going to become physical after a while. You know, if you spend, you know, and nobody sits there and go, right, I'm going to make myself small in order to be safe because I'm in a traumatic household, and my gender conditioning is that girls are supposed to be that way, or my ethnic conditioning, and no one consciously decides. They just kind of take on a pattern, and then it starts to feel like them. So actually, most people's experience when they've actually had some sort of body work and things, sometimes, it's like feels good, but other times it's like, this doesn't feel like me. This feels weird. You know, you can spend an hour. One of my teachers, I remember telling a story about spending an hour adjusting someone's head neck relationship, and it's like, oh, there you go, beautiful. Physically, it's done. And then, you know, they walk out the office. Half an hour later, he's having a sandwich, and he happens to see them walking across the road, and they're back in the position they're in.
Yeah,
because they'd reassert, their sort of being had reasserted itself. So yeah, there's all those kind of layers of it. And you know, there's huge cultural pieces there as well. Like there's a sort of performative layer. Like that's something I get very much from students in the US. is there's a kind of public performance happening. I remember the first time I went to the States when I was 18, a guy comes up to me and he says, "Hey, I love your t-shirt, buddy." And I was like, "You're not on TV, mate. What the fuck are you doing that for?" Like he just was like almost like acting like he was on TV. And there's like certain cultures orientate in that way more. So there's all sorts of pieces in there, but yeah, it's definitely aligned with unconscious embodiment.
Yeah, and mine probably was a performative in nature, right? It's a performative way of me putting on this muscular strain to try and appear a certain way. Yeah.
And we've all got to do something. So I say to people like, be kind to yourself here. You know, we're all screwed up, right? We've all like, even we've all got some.
We're humans
as well, right? Yeah, and part of being humans means we develop these patterns, right?
Yeah.
Like we're all enculturated. We're all got individual trauma patterns, and you know, you see kids have less of them because they're less enculturated, right? Like young kids, their postures are more similar, right? And then you look at 50-year-olds and their postures have diverged in different directions because they're different patterns they're playing out.
Totally. I'm curious. So I feel like you would have a lot to say on this. Not only, so you're the first male guest I've had on the podcast. Also with your diverse, I think, background and diverse amount of people you work with all over the world. So I feel like you can bring like more of a male perspective as well as like a broader cultural perspective to this conversation around, like body image. Like specifically, one of my overarching intentions with radical embodiment is to help shift the narrative that a woman's worth is tied into her weight. But it's not just, I think, women who are put under pressure to look a certain way or to try and be hyper obsessed with their physical appearance. So I would just, from that, what comes up for you, I guess, just being male bodied, and, you know, what is your experience, especially being in the embodiment world, and how has maybe the more you've been in the embodiment world help shift, if you've had your own personal stories around trying to control your body to look a certain way?
How many female guests have you had on, just out of interest?
Well, so it's actually, this season is my first season of interviews. So I think you'll be the 6th guest. So there's just been 5 women so far, but there'll be 12 guests this season. Yeah.
Well, I speak for all men. I represent all men. I've been elected. So, you know, on behalf,
I mean, there's going to be
my people.
In coming seasons, I'll have more men on.
I'm messing with you. And I'm not male bodied. I'm a man. Okay. Like I just speak normally about this stuff. Like I think language got very strange recently about this whole topic. So certainly men are increasingly affected by body image stuff. And I'd say, if anything, portrayals of male ideal, inverted commas, body images in the media are even more unrealistic than portrayals of women's. So let's take the average Avengers movie, like a popular Hollywood movie. You see one of the Avengers with their top off. There's always an obligatory man has to take his top off because he's on fire or something kind of scene, and it will be Chris Hemsworth or someone like that. Beautiful, beautiful man. Let's take that example. Chris Hemsworth has taken steroids for several months beforehand. Almost certainly. I feel like I can put that out there because I'd love to see them challenge that legally. On top of that, he's massively dehydrated in that scene. So he spent 2 days at least with barely a drop of water, maybe sucking an ice cube. On top of that, he's pumped himself beforehand. So he's done a quick gym session before he takes his top off. He's had one of the best personal trainers in Hollywood, and had a dietitian. And he's feeling weak, and he's really just dying to get a cheeseburger. I think I've heard an interview with him at that point. So he doesn't look like that for long. He just looks like that for the scene that he does. So he's gone through this massive and pretty unhealthy and pretty hardcore and not affordable by most people's expenses or time or energy. He's a professional. Credit to him for doing it. It's hardcore. And then that is the image that men are supposed to look like. And that is an extreme. I go to the gym pretty regularly. I'm stronger than most guys my age. I don't have a 6-pack. I don't have 10% body fat. Like that is ridiculous, man. You hear people say, I like a dad bod, and what they mean by a dad bod is Chris Hemsworth after a sandwich, So I'd say that sort of the body image stuff, I think women rightly have said, hey, this is bullshit. and they're, you know, standing up around the world and to say like, hey, you know, how dare you say I should look a certain way, that my worth is linked to my weight or whatever. And I think that's very right. But in some ways, we've dragged men down to the same level in the general culture rather than elevated women. And I know for young men, things like steroid use, and, you know, it's endemic. In my gym, there's lots of young guys looking in the mirror and checking how they're doing, kind of thing. So yeah, a bit of a rant, but I think it's a lot of pressure, particularly on young men, to look in a way that is unattainable to most people, and certainly takes a huge commitment.
Sounds like huge commitment, and generally actually pretty unhealthy.
Yeah, I mean, steroid use, dehydration, low body fat, tremendously bad for you. Like, I want to cut weight for a fight to make weight, and you're cold, you're drained, your sex drive goes down because your testosterone levels dip. I mean, being not being obese, but being a very low body fat, like most of the movie stars, is extremely uncomfortable and unhealthy.
Yeah. So I think that I just appreciate you just sharing that, because it's a male, female. I think there's just these unrealistic narratives of how we should look. And, you know, anyone who's tried to be in that ideal usually creates really unhealthy relationships with food, really unhealthy relationships with our body, really unhealthy relationships with exercise. And in my experience, the more that I learned about embodiment and began to learn just different practices of like, oh my gosh, like, what is it like to actually be in my pelvis? And to have that experience is actually what started to shift my own relationship with, like, of course, with my body, because I'm in it more, but it started to shift how I oriented around food, how I oriented around exercise. And I'm curious, have you experienced something similar? Have you seen that? And you've worked with so many, like thousands of students. Is that a part of the conversation?
Yeah, generally when people get in touch with their bodies, like, all sorts of things come up. So, you know, you talk about embodying, coming in touch with your fat and embodying your fat as part of your beautiful self. You know, like, I feel like that's challenging. That's challenging for me, let alone people that listen to embodiment.
I just had a little cringe.
Squirt,
like, ooh, right. Yeah, actually, I don't think about my fat cells.
like really, like, you know, spend an hour like really rolling around and getting in touch with the the fat layer of your body. And, you know, all the sorts of, you could look up all the biology of it, all the uses of fat as well. You know, it's more than just an energy store. And, you know, I can tell if someone's comfortable with that. You know, like this Greek person I was with today, she was quite round and quite comfortable with that. It was a sort of juicy, I'm going to say feminine, kind of wholesome, you know, there was a sort of bosom-like quality to a whole embodiment of sort of nurturance and warmth and connection. And, you know, that came from, this is someone who's okay with their fat, right? In the same way as if you're okay with your muscle, that would bring something else out, right? Like power and expression and movement. So I think that's true. Other things come up as soon as we get in touch with our bodies. You know, sexuality comes up. That can challenge some people. Obviously, the whole trauma thing can come up for a lot of people. You know, going deeply into my heart this morning, it was like, oh God, you know, pain and loss and all sorts of things kind of come up from that. And yeah, I spoke to my masseuse, who's just a traditional Swedish style, you know, hard back rub type masseuse. And she said, oh yeah, people cry all the time when she's massaging them. And they don't have a narrative about embodiment. So they're confused. And she has to kind of explain to them, you know, the issues in the tissues and all that. They're just like, why am I crying? You know, like, they don't get it.
Yeah.
And it's, if we do conscious embodied work, we do bump into all the aspects of the body. And even if you're like cognitively okay with them, you could be like cognitively like, hey, I'm a sex positive kind of person, right? Like, all consensual sex between adults is great, you know, no problem. Cognitively, you might have that view, but it's like, okay, let's find out what happens when we're rolling our pelvises around for an hour and, you know, kind of deeply embodying some of the tissues of the genitals, or this brings stuff up. Completely.
I mean, the body doesn't lie, right? I think, and I feel like until like the body, I think it's such an essential piece in our personal development journey, in our growth journey, in our, like, you know, spiritual evolvement, whatever someone's beliefs are, of not that you can't make progress or make shifts or move forward in your life until the body's on board, but until the body's really on board, I think you're going to be a little like halted.
No, you absolutely can't make big shifts in your life unless the body's on board. I mean, it's just going to sabotage anything you try.
I had a client a couple, like last week, I think she's early on in working with me. She's a couple weeks in, and we were ending a call and she was like, Emily, this is not easy work. Like, she's like, this is really, what you're asking me to do is really hard. And I was like, oh no, is she mad at me? And then I would ask her to define that. She was just like, you're basically asking me to, like, all the things I've been suppressing for years, you're asking me to be with and feel it. And I'm feeling for the first time. And I always tell them it's courageous work, right? It's not, it can be easeful, but it's not easy. But it's, I think, so rewarding.
It's brave. And, you know, how resourced are people is a good question. And,
yes.
And also just asking people to do something uncomfortable. I mean, it's kind of like learning to brush your teeth with your left hand or something, right? Like, like we're asking people to practice something different, something new that actually may go against conditioning. And the body does lie. The body lies like a motherfucker. Like the body says, hey, you're not safe to practice. Don't say no. You're safe if you say yes to everyone. Yeah, because there's been a certain conditioning there. I'm just using boundaries as an example. That's something a lot of my clients have an issue with, you know. And again, it's not logical. They can say the word no. They know they have a right to say no to whatever it is. And then, but in their system, there's this feeling of like, don't do it. Don't do it. Yeah. So that's where the practices come in to build the body of no. You know, we have like a no pose that we work with in coaching and might give them a practice and different things.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point, because I was like, the body doesn't lie, but it's sneaky, I guess. Yeah, when you're really in it, you can't ignore the sensation, or you can. It just becomes more challenging once you feel it. What do you see as some of the, like, in the embodiment world? This is a big question, and I can distill it down if you'd like me to. But what do you see as like some of like the common mistakes, or even since you're so involved in like the teaching world, maybe as in the marketing that you see around embodiment, what are some things that kind of
where to begin? I mean, training teachers is what I do, right? Like, I'm a third generation teacher, and I'm not good at much. I'm not the most embodied person in the world, but I'm pretty good at teaching teachers. And there's a lot of stuff we teach. I mean, first one is like, are you embodied? Like, do you have a practice? Like, people talking about embodiment without having a practice, that would be like a fundamental mistake, right? Because it's not a cognitive thing. How it's taught, a big one I work with is language. Most people teaching embodiment are using very inexact language, which is kind of poetic, metaphor-y, pretentious, unhelpful. You know, we make, like, have a whole game around this on some courses where it's like, what's the worst yoga instruction you've ever been given? You know, blossom your anus chakra or something. You know, we kind of make fun of it, and we do another game.
I've never been given that, and I wish I was given.
You're embodied. You can get worse instructions than that.
I need to go to that yoga class.
Blossom your anus chakra, which is a piece of poetry or humor, of course, is fine, right? But the instruction isn't particularly clear. Someone's going to write you an angry letter. Actually, I do that all the time. So looking at what's called operational language, that would be a major mistake. I think thinking you have to fit in with a kind of woke ideology, that's a recent mistake, I would say. You have to be some sort of far left. People go from trauma sensitive, which I recommend, to sort of trauma pandering, which I don't. And sort of everyone's terribly sensitive and delicate and broken. And it makes me laugh, because I teach far more robust classes in Ukraine than I would ever dare teach in the United States or the UK. Being a bit mean on the US today, so I should say it. Otherwhere too, Canada as well. So I think that's another mistake. In terms of marketing, not being empathic enough for your clients. Like people generally in their marketing talk about all their modalities, or they just come across as weird. They come across as just weird hippies. And it's like, well, unless your clients are that, why are you speaking funny? Like be normal. And also, like, what's their problem? They don't care if you do, you know, non-linear Iyengar, tantric, contact underwater dolphin yoga. They don't care. They have a problem. Like, be empathic to that. The other thing I'm seeing in the moment in the embodiment space now, in kind of social media marketing, is pornography disguised as empowerment. So usually young women, some young men, sort of showing their asses off, and then kind of saying that, hey, this is body positivity and you're not a real feminist if you dislike this. And they're really just selling with their asses, and it's not good pornography.
Yeah.
and it's not good marketing in my view. I think it is there's a dishonesty to that, which is very hard to call out, because as soon as you do, people are like, oh, you're sexist, oh, you're body negative, who are you saying? I just happen to have my signal between my breasts, you know. And I think there's some real nonsense in that that's very popular right now.
It is. I actually, with my hairstylist last week, we were having a conversation around that type of, you know, post, and it gets more engagement on social media, right? But I always go back to, and I can't decipher somebody else's intentionality, right, or their motivating factor for sharing something. I can only speak from my own. But I think it's important when we're making those sorts of posts or sharing to, what is your intention? What is it that you're hoping to get out of this? And if it's, you know, I just am always also careful, because I do work with women specifically around body image, right? And I want to celebrate my body, and I can't help that others are probably going to compare their bodies to mine. And I'm very aware of that when I'm showing my body online. It's not what I'm not wanting to invite that per se.
Yeah, and I'm just like, hey, be honest is all my thing. Like, be honest. What are you trying to do here? Be honest with yourself, first of all.
Yes.
Because people are fooling themselves.
Be honest with yourself.
Come on, what are we doing here?
What is your
trying to get the likes? Okay, great.
Yeah. You know what I'd like to dive into, Mark, because I was really curious when you shared it. And since you just spent this, I guess it wasn't your morning, it was your day, afternoon, you're in London time, is going a little bit into each layer of the body. And I feel like you have such language of what is the maybe embodied sensation, meaning you gave a brief description of that little felt sense of maybe even just connecting with the Greek woman of, you know, it seemed like she was in her adipose tissue, she was in her fat, and that more feminine nurturing quality versus this, what is maybe if you're embodying your muscles, what is that like versus your organs? What might that feel like? I'm kind of like just personally curious, if you don't mind, if it seems like you've kind of defined out different body, like our bones. I always feel like our bones carry so much, like deep.
I kind of want to have some humility here, because it's not my specialism, and I want to point people to like Bonnie Bainbridge-Cohen or Katie Dimmock in the UK. There's some Nina Verhardt in Germany. There's some really good BMC teachers and embodied anatomy teachers. I'm forgetting some really good ones. Martha Eddy on the East Coast. There's a woman in Canada whose name I'm forgetting. So there's some really
BMC teachers. What is BMC?
Body mind centering. So a big part of that body of work. I'm not qualified in it. I'm not an expert in it. Big part of that body of work is experiential anatomy, and there are other schools of experiential anatomy as well. I had Andrea Olsen, for example, on my podcast recently, who's big experiential anatomist, who's influenced by BMC or has other influences. Martha Eddy too. So there's a whole body of work of experiential anatomy that has different schools, but BMC is one of the kind of biggest ones, and I think they're very expert in it, and really impressively so. So you know, I kind of, while there's things I know about, that's one I just happen to have been in a course as a participant today, so I'm very in touch with that today.
Yeah.
And I would say for listeners, there is a common sense element here, though. Like if you do a yoga class that's really like about alignment, you're really feeling the bones, right? Like, how do you come out of that class feeling, as opposed to a very muscular class? And even there, we could differentiate between like pulling and pushing.
Yeah.
Most yoga's pushing, and in the gym I do a pull day and a push day, and I feel very different afterwards.
Yeah.
You know, towards and away. And then the skin, you know, how is it if you kind of like get a gentle massage, and your lover's rubbing oil on your skin, and you're kind of in the sun on the beach, and it's just the right amount of sun and wind. You know, like we all have an experience of being in the sensuality of the skin, for example. Yeah. And then, you know, the organs maybe a little deeper, a little bit more for people to explore themselves. And I feel people do have like a default, you know, they have a default that they go to, plus their practices will encourage a certain thing, even to the point actually that you think of kind of mindfulness in layers, right? Like they talk about foundations of mindfulness in traditional Buddhism. I think one reason a lot of people are doing very strong athletic practice is it actually stops them feeling the more subtle layer. You know, if you're doing hot yoga and your skin's boiling hot and your hamstrings are screaming, you're not noticing that like subtle melancholic loneliness in the heart,
Mm.
because your heart's pounding at 140 beats per minute and you're just not picking up on it. So there's a way actually we can use strong physicality to dissociate one system from another. Yes, there's a little bit on that. That's probably all I should say.
No, thank you for even, because I think it just helps even just invite anyone listening, that idea to start to discern for themselves of, what would it be like? You gave great examples of just like being more at a skin level, or just starting to also decipher when you are doing different movement practices, what does that evoke within you, which I think is an important for each of us internally to start becoming more aware of those felt senses, of having those questions. Because it can be really helpful and supportive if we are feeling a certain way and want to support ourselves. And
I mean, there's so many good practices in places like we're lucky enough to live, and all around the world in many places now, much more than when I started this stuff. It's really spread, which is great. And then we're left with the question, well, what do I do on a Tuesday night? Right. And people can just deepen their neurosis. They can get more and more uptight by doing Iyengar yoga every night. I would make the joke, I once went to an Iyengar yoga class in Zurich, and it was like the most anally retentive uptight thing I've ever done. And now that's probably quite good for someone like me who's chaotic and ADHD all over the place. I probably would have really benefited from going to that class regularly. And actually I do an Iyengar based yoga class regularly before anyone writes in saying, but Iyengar's great. But for other people, that would be the last thing they need. So the good question is this building the embodiment that I need? It's okay sometimes just to do stuff you enjoy just because it's fun. I like to go kick some pads, and then I just
I think it's important to do what's fun for you.
You need a mix, right? Like I'd say you need a mix of what's fun enough but growing you, so not awful. It's kind of like an arranged marriage. And what's sort of just for the joy of it, for the Yahoo, let's just like a pig in shit doing our own thing. People always ask me, like, what embodied practice should I do? And I say, if you're a complete beginner, do anything you enjoy, because just getting into the body is a huge gift. It's a huge gift in the modern world. And then if you're a little bit more advanced, if like us, you've been around a bit, you've done some different stuff, you might want to start thinking about it a bit more strategically in terms of what you're actually building.
Yeah. And I think I just want to reiterate on that too, the different stages we're in our lives, right? If there's something really intense happening in your life, or you're in some intense nervous system level stress, it could be really important to be mindful of what embodiment practices or movement practices are you doing that could help bring some support to your system, versus pushing you more into that state of stress.
Sure. I mean, I was teaching in Ukraine, trauma education work while under rocket fire this year. And we did, 2 hours of embodied practice a day just to regulate everyone well enough to learn. Because the context were, there are Russians trying to kill us. That was the context. That's a very different context than, hey, I've just spent a week on holiday lying on the beach. Now I'm kind of bored and I want to challenge myself.
Totally. Do you mind sharing some of the work that you're doing in Ukraine?
No.
It's really amazing. Yeah,
I've been out there a bunch of times. So I met my wife, who's my interpreter there in the first part of this current war. So this is a sort of continuity of a smaller war, essentially. And I was asked to do some trauma work there. And it's a nice romance story, actually. It was a complete setup. So I was working with some coaches, and they said, well, we're starting having a war. Can you teach trauma? We haven't got much money, but I was like, okay, yeah, we'll do it. You don't have to pay me much, it's fine. And then she just ensured, and she knew I didn't date my students, which in Ukraine is tremendous hardship because it's so beautiful people. And but that she sort of rightly assumed that interpreters probably didn't count because they are my colleagues. So I turned up at this big somatic event, and I had 7 interpreters, all of whom were beautiful, smart, lovely, about the right age single women. And I thought, how did that happen? Not knowing that this course was a complete setup, of course, by the person who wanted me to come back and keep teaching. So anyway, one of these people was my wife, and we got on very well. And we ended up dating, and she was my interpreter in Moscow while I was doing some work there, and in Ukraine quite a lot. So I developed quite a lot of contacts and friendships, both in Russia and Ukraine, over the last kind of 10 years. And then when this part of the war happened, I really kind of felt like I wanted to do something to be helpful. My first instinct was actually to go fight. But as one of my friends pointed out, I'd make a terrible soldier, but I'm a pretty good trauma trainer. So I'm not a therapist, but I teach the basics of trauma awareness pretty well, and the basics go a long way when in a war zone. I've worked in various other areas of conflict before, like Sierra Leone, Afghanistan, and different places, East Africa, Israel many times. And so yeah, went out there, trained a bunch of people. We delivered some medical supplies to the Children's Hospital on the first trip because they were having a problem. So we raised a bunch of money and did that. Kind of an adventure. I'm not going to lie, it was a lot of fun. And then did a training, trained 100 trainers. And then second time came back, trained 100 more. And eventually set up a local charity. It's now run by 2 Ukrainian women. Just thought it'd be better if it was run locally. They're getting funding off the Red Cross and things now. And they've trained tens of thousands of people, including all the teachers and all the doctors and nurses in Lviv, which is one of the biggest cities in Ukraine. So they've done a great job, and I'm very proud of all of them. Very brave, mostly women, because a lot of the men are fighting, but some men as well. And yeah, just wonderful group of people I have a lot of love for. And I've been sort of supervising them from afar with the help of a few other generous trauma trainers and teachers. And we did it in conjunction with a local, there were some local trauma psychologists who said, look, we're completely overwhelmed. You're not doing therapy, but if you can teach people about trauma, that goes a long way. So teaching some what's called trauma first aid, and just basic trauma education work. Yeah, and their sort of vision is to make Ukraine actually the world's most trauma aware country. And it's quite well supported, and people get it, and people are quite open to it, which is cool. Obviously, you know, I mean, I hear horror stories on a daily basis. It's pretty rough what's going on out there. But yeah, it's been a big part of my year. So I don't know, that's probably enough for now.
Yeah, no, I appreciate hearing more specifics of what you're doing and how it's continuing, I think, to expand, right? The fact that you're teaching them and they have that and are continuing to teach others. So needed. I'd love, so you've already defined what you have as embodiment. So if somebody's wanting to, I'm calling this idea of like wanting to live a radically embodied life, which for me means like, it's making the conscious choice to really like consistently, I want to be in my body.
And it's countercultural, right, as well. Like that is radical because it's countercultural.
Yeah.
Like we're not just disembodied as a mistake. There we are actively disembodied by the culture we live in. So it is radical to make that choice.
Yes. Yeah. So what would you give as like a one main takeaway for somebody if they're wanting to live a more radically embodied life? Would that be
one takeaway?
I always know it can sometimes be hard to distill to one, but whatever that brings up for you.
Okay. I'm going to cheat and say 3: people,
Great.
place, and practice. So if you can be in a place where there's nature or spend time in nature, if you live in a city, great. The most important are people and place. People is spend time around other embodiment people. Like if you're in nature with other embodiment people, you barely have to practice. And what I would say though is practice is the one we can control. So if I was to pick one, I'd say, well, the one we could all do something about is like have some kind of embodied practice that you enjoy. Like that's really key. Just have some kind of embodied practice you enjoy. Doesn't have to be hours and hours of yoga a day. You don't have to be spiritual or special, just something that gets you moving, gets you feeling your body, gets you back in your system. Because, you know, sitting on a computer online, it's not gonna do it. You know what I mean? There's only so many hours a day I can spend on Facebook before I go crazy. So yeah. So you said people, place, and practice. Yeah, the 3 Ps, and of those, in some ways, practice is the least important, but it's the one we can control the most, right? Not everyone can go live in the woods. Not everyone can be surrounded by wonderful embodiment people. But I feel like I should mention those as the context to practice, because they will either support or undermine your practice.
And I think it's important to name too of, just bringing more intentionality of where are we spending, or if you are.
What do other people say? I'm curious. What are some good answers you've had? Like I always like to learn something when I'm being interviewed. So,
well, somebody actually was different, but it actually has a similarity, because even her definition of embodiment was more of like an integration of your external and internal environments. And so for her, like place, like where she lives is really important. She also happens to be in Boulder, but has lived all over the world. But so it feels like it was congruent with that. A little bit has place. Somebody else's was Oh, let's see. I'm like, do I remember what everyone has shared?
Oh, it's okay. I'll listen to some of them. I can look.
Yeah,
it up
I'm like, I
can't remember now.
it's funny when I'm trying to reach for national. I'm like, I don't remember. But ask me in 5 minutes.
Make a book of it. Make an ebook out of it. And like, if I was being cheeky, and there's lots of great answers, right? I could also say like, hey, have lots of good sex. I could say
it's important.
That's important. I could say avoid the political far left and the far right, both of which have different ways to disembody you. Yeah. Like that would be my like political answer. Like I think I'd give a different answer on a different day.
Yeah. Yeah. What about if somebody specifically has been challenged? A lot of my listeners, like, it is focused on like, are primarily women and have had challenges with actually loving their body and have been in this constant of like, if I just lose 10 pounds, then I'll be happy. So if somebody's on that kind of a journey, what might you suggest? Do
the experiment, lose 10 pounds, and then realize you're still miserable. That's the obvious answer. No, I mean, first of all, I'd just be kind. If anyone came to me with that, I'd just be really kind to them, because it's like, I get it. Like, I get it. Like, I'm not immune to that, even as a teacher of this stuff. Yeah. I'd say we've all got to do the trauma work as well, right? We haven't talked a huge amount about that, but trauma is the disembodiment comes from trauma. It's a way to feel safe in one's body when there's been overwhelming experience. So, doing trauma work in whatever form that may come in, I think is really key. It's really key there as well.
Yeah. Yeah. Amazing. Anything else as we wrap up, Mark, that you want to name or speak to? I know you have a training that's coming up.
Oh, we've always got stuff. People can check us out, embodimentunlimited.com. Lots of free things there, free resources, free books, podcasts from different embodiment teachers, embodiment books on Amazon, the embodiment podcast, which you're going to be on. So, like, depending on people's format, they can look us up on. I think embodimentunlimited.com is the place that has the most free resources on embodiment. There's loads of stuff there. And we have a coach training that starts every January. People can put their name for kind of interest list in if they want to be an embodiment coach. I think kind of a key context right now, aside from just kind of plugging my stuff, is we're in a time of chaos. There's a war in Europe. Mm-hmm. There's going to be famine, very likely. We've just come out of a plague. We might have another one that's worse. Economically, it's a really rough time for a lot of people. That's not always apparent depending on where in the world you are, but it's starting to become apparent to a lot of people I know. And for some, it's been apparent for a while. And I feel like that time of chaos, like, embodiment becomes a necessity, not just a luxury. And I think we also need to cut ourselves some slack. We might not want to do such challenging practices like we were talking about earlier, and be gentle with ourselves, given that is the context. And what I'm also musing about personally is this idea that, given that context, let's be careful as embodiment teachers, we're not just enabling that we're actually speaking to that, the kind of systemic, the bigger side of things, and not just being like, okay, I know your government's ripped you off and the media's lying to you and you've got no money, but here's yoga. Like that's a little, you don't offer a drowning man yoga, you offer him to be less stressed, you offer him a raft. So I think we've, like, that bigger context needs considering deeply from the embodiment community.
That's important, just the state of the world. And I even just appreciate that you just briefly said too, with all of, depending on where you are at personally and all that's happening, when you're in an area or time of distress, it's not probably the time to go into your deepest levels of your cells and the parts of your emotions that you've never maybe felt, right? Like, it is important. I think I love that you said embodiment is essential in those times, and be gentle. Yeah.
Nice. Okay. Good conversation.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Emily.
Thanks everyone for listening. You can go to Embodiment Unlimited and everything will be linked. And
cheers.
Stop the recording.